Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for what I think is going to be the fourth instalment of my Mystery History Week. I'm uploading every day this week at 4:30 p.m. I hope that you guys have been enjoying my videos so far this week. I've got some good cases coming up for you still. We're just over halfway through. So whilst I was online looking for new cases to cover for this week, I found the story of the Clutter family murders, referred to as where the true crime genre began, and therefore I knew that I kind of had to cover it on this channel, an homage to the genre of sorts. And why are these murders considered to be the birth of the true crime genre? Well, because of the non-fiction novel In Cold Blood, written by American author Truman Capote. It was first published in 1966 and detailed the 1959 murders of the Clutter family in Kansas. Capote learned of the murders and decided to travel to Kansas to learn and write about the crime. He actually took along Harper Lee, who was his childhood friend and neighbour and fellow author of the classic To Kill a Mockingbird, along with him, and together they worked on the basis of the book. Capote worked on the book for 6 years before it was published, at which point it became an instant success. To this day, it's the second best-selling true crime book in history, behind only Helter Skelter, about the Manson family murders. Now, it's worth saying that In Cold Blood, I've got my copy right here, it's fairly criticised nowadays, with people saying that many of the details are over-dramatised or changed to fit the narrative, and it's all used as a storytelling device. But all in all, it's a good source of information and it is packed to the brim with details. Maybe you've read In Cold Blood, maybe you haven't. Maybe you've read it and you didn't realise that it was actually a non-fiction novel. Everything in this is based on true events. I mean, I would say that whilst you're reading it, it doesn't immediately strike you as a non-fiction novel. I mean, it does say, like, literally at the very beginning, a true account of multiple murder and its consequences. So if you pay attention, then you'll obviously know that it's a non-fiction true crime account. But I must say that whilst reading it, it didn't strike me as a non-fiction novel. It reads as like a fiction book. And I think that makes it all the more shocking when you realise that everything that Capote sort of writes about in this is true life. So let me tell you the story of the 1959 Clutter family murders. Herbert William Clutter was born on the 24th of May 1911. He was a graduate of Kansas State University and a long-time member of the First United Methodist Church. He was well known and well respected in the small community he lived in Holcomb, Kansas, which was a small rural town. And when I say small, I mean small. The 1970 census said the population was just 272 people. So I can imagine that it was probably a little bit smaller than that, or around the same, in 1959 when the crime took place. It was the kind of place where the main street was a dirt street, doors were never locked, no one was really a stranger, everyone literally knew everyone. And Herbert was the kind of guy who would always take the time to talk to a person in a room. He made people feel safe and noticed. He was a very successful farmer. He owned River Valley Farm, which was slightly more than 620 acres of land. So he was a really successful businessman and he was highly thought of in the agriculture world. And he was pretty wealthy as well. The Clutter family had a 14-room house on the farmland, the kind of house that people would literally stop to admire on their journeys. He'd had it built in 1948 for $40,000, which was a lot of money in those days. So he was a wealthy man, but he never showed off about his money. Herbert was married to Bonnie Clutter, and together they had 4 children, Ivana, Beverly, Nancy and Kenyon. The 2 older girls had moved out by 1959, so it was just Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy and Kenyon left in the home. In Cold Blood writes a lot about Bonnie's mental health, saying that she suffered from postnatal depression after the birth of her children, and this continued into periodic bouts of depression throughout the rest of her life. It also writes that she had physical ailments in the form of a misplaced vertebrae on her spine. Doctors had reportedly told her that this was the source of all her problems, that she needed an operation to fix it, and her mental health would be cured alongside her physical health. However, her poor health may have been an area of the book where Capote took a little bit of artistic license, shall we say. Surviving family members do dispute this characterisation of Bonnie. She wasn't an ill or ailing person. She loved being outside, she loved being the host. She was always hosting some kind of party or gathering at their house. She was described as a true lady. And actually at the time of their deaths, they were looking forward to this massive family Thanksgiving with all of the extended family coming in across the country to the Clutter house just to celebrate Thanksgiving, and Bonnie was really looking forward to hosting it. Nancy Clutter was born on January 2nd, 1943, making her 16 years old when she was murdered. Like the rest of her family, she was liked and respected within Holcombe. She had a really wide group of friends. She attended church every single week. She enjoyed baking and riding a horse, Babe. She didn't have a mean bone in her body, according to her boyfriend, Bobby. And then there's Kenyon, who was a year and a half younger than Nancy, born on August 29th, 1944, so he would have been 15 at the time of his death. Kenyon was the kind of person who was always wanting to be up and about. He never sat down, he never sat still for a single second. He was a jokester, he was always messing around, and he was really on the cusp of becoming a man, and then his life was taken from him. It was the 15th of November 1959 when things went wrong. It was a Sunday, and every single week 2 of Nancy's friends would turn up at the house and knock for her so they could all go to church together. But that Sunday they knock and there's no answer at the house, both the front door and the back. The cars were still in the garage and everything looked completely normal, but there was just no answer at the door. They try to call the house phone and there's no answer, so they go once again back to the house, this time trying the front door, and they find it to be unlocked. So they just walk into the house. They continue calling for Nancy, but the house is eerily quiet. The friends just head up to Nancy's room expecting to find her still asleep. Instead they find her dead in her bed with blood all over the walls. The father of one of the friends is actually waiting outside the house and decides to go into the home himself to call the police. But he notices that the receiver is off the hook and the phone lines have been cut. So instead they drive elsewhere and call the police from there, telling them that there is something very wrong at the Clutter residence. The scene the police found was a horrifying sight. Herbert was found in the furnace room in the basement, bound and gagged, shot in the front of the head with a 12-gauge shotgun, and his throat had been slit. Kenyon was in another room in the basement, tied to the couch, bound and gagged also, and again shot in the front of the head with a shotgun. Bonnie was found in her room, bound and gagged and shot in the side of the head with the same shotgun. And Nancy was in her bed, once again bound, but she was shot in the back of her head with a shotgun. And the police found it very interesting that Nancy was the only person who had been shot in the back of the head. She would have been the only victim not looking at her killer as she died. Was it possibly someone connected to her, somebody that could bear thought of her looking at them as they killed her? As a result of this, the community was brought to a standstill. The Clutter family were one of the most upstanding families in the community, and they were well liked by everyone, and I'm not just saying that. Literally nobody had a bad word to say about any of them. Nobody had any idea why these murders had occurred. They had no enemies or quarrels with anyone. They didn't know if it was somebody local in this very small community that did it, somebody who would be considered a friend or an acquaintance. And people got scared. All the hardware stores in the area quickly sold out of locks as people started to lock their front doors for the first time in their lives. So where did the police even begin looking here? They took detailed photos of every room in the house and of the victims. They searched for fingerprints. They analysed a single footprint found on the floor in the basement, which was left next to Herb in his blood. It was a cat paw, half-soled boot. The police analysed the home intently, looking for clues, but all they could find missing was a little portable radio and a pair of binoculars. It was strange because it was obvious that these 2 small items were not the motive behind these murders. But they do find something that may have been a possible motive. It turns out on the afternoon before the murder, Herb Clutter took out a $40,000 double indemnity life insurance. As a result of the murders, that money went directly to his 2 remaining daughters. Were his daughters responsible for the murder of their own family? On deeper inspection, it turned out that this probably wasn't the case. It was just bad timing, a huge coincidence. This new life insurance policy had been in the works for many, many months. It was just that he'd signed it that afternoon, and so the police quickly realised that it probably wasn't their two surviving daughters, who were absolutely distraught. So the police begin by talking to Nancy's boyfriend, a boy called Bobby Rupp. Not a suspect, they said, they just wanted to speak to him. He'd spent the evening they died with Nancy at the Clutter home. He'd left just after 10 PM that night. They'd been planning on going to a midnight movie on Saturday, but Herb suggested that they go to the Friday night one instead, so they did. If this hadn't been the case, Nancy would likely still be alive today. It's documented that Herb didn't approve of Nancy's relationship with Bobby, and it's not that Herb didn't like Bobby. He thought that he was dependable, he thought that he was gentlemanly, always treated Nancy with respect. But Nancy was 16 and she'd been hanging around with Bobby for 3 years, and so Herb just thought that she was a bit young to put all of her eggs in one basket, especially because the relationship couldn't actually go anywhere. The Clutters were Methodist and the Rupps were Roman Catholic, and Herb had actually asked Nancy to put the brakes on the relationship to slow things down, but Bobby continued hanging around. I mean, he was literally at the house a couple of hours before things went down. He was the last person to see the family alive. So I think it was only natural for the police to look more carefully into Bobby. But after an interview and a polygraph test, it becomes clear that he had nothing to do with it. He was just a 17-year-old boy, head over heels for Nancy Clutter. He wasn't capable of murder. But just the fact that he was the last person to see the family alive and the police had pulled him in for questioning made the rest of the community hugely suspicious of him, and he was automatically guilty in their eyes. And it was actually so bad that Bobby had to transfer high schools just to get away from all the judgment. He went to a different high school in a different town. And then there were Herb Clutter's business rivals, another natural avenue to investigate. But each person the police looked into was just another dead end. It was absolutely baffling. A whole family dead and seemingly no motive. It started to become clear to the police that this may have just been an advantageous murder, just some stick person wanting to see what they could do. A local newspaper, the Hutchinson News, offers a $1,000 reward for any information that led to the capture of the murderers. But instead it just led to a load of useless tips. 250 leads came in that were just complete dead ends. On the Wednesday after the murder, the funeral of the Clutter family took place. Their family came in from across the country to pay their respects. Imagine being one of the two oldest daughters attending the funeral of the rest of their family. I can't even bear to think about how painful that must be. But there was actually a small amount of light to come out of all this darkness. The Clutter's second daughter, Beverly, was engaged to be married that December. And as the police had no idea of the motivation behind the murders, they actually advised Beverly that it would be smart to change her name now rather than wait for the marriage. They didn't want the killer to potentially be able to track her down if it was a problem with the Clutter family as a whole. But Beverly had a different idea. All the family were in town for the funeral, so she might as well get married now. If she's going to have to change her name anyway, why not just get married? So she did, and everyone attended. Family, friends, church members, the entire community. It was described as a fairy tale wedding in the middle of a nightmare. As you can guess, the case just kinda went cold. There were no leads, people had no clues. There weren't even the usual small town whispers of suspicion that you would usually hear. All the police had were the many photographs they'd taken at the crime scene, and it was actually in one of these many photographs in which they finally found a pivotal piece of evidence. I mentioned earlier that they found a footprint in blood in the basement near Herbert's body. Well, once they got the photographs developed, they could see that there was actually another footprint in dust that they couldn't see with the naked eye, but that the camera had picked up in the light. Once they found the second print of a different boot, they realised that they weren't just looking for one suspect here. They were looking for two. I mean, it didn't exactly help with the investigation any further. They still didn't know where to start, but at least now they knew they were looking for two people rather than one. But it turns out this case was about to get solved with just a little bit of luck and the right people talking. 10 days after the murders, the police received word that somebody had an important piece of information. That $1,000 reward offer from the Hutchinson News had caught the eye of an inmate at Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, Kansas, and an FBI detective was sent to interview him. This man was 32-year-old Floyd Wells, and he'd worked for the Clutters 10 years previously in 1948 and 1949. Wells had had a number of different careers and he'd never quite settled anywhere. He was a soldier, ranch hand, mechanic. He began working with the Clutters on the farm around the time their fancy new house had just been completed. He was 19 at the time, and he really enjoyed his time with the Clutters, who treated him well. A nice family, he said, real nice. He remembered how at Christmas time Mr. Clutter had given him an extra $50 of the bonus, and they treated him with kindness. Wells finishes working for the Clutters in 1949 and he goes on to get married, divorced, he enters the army. 10 years pass by till June 1959 and Wells is arrested for burglary and larceny for breaking into an electrical appliance store. He decided he wanted to start his own business. He wanted to start a lawnmower rental service. But for that, he needed a lawnmower, so he breaks into an electrical appliance store to steal a lawnmower. He's caught, and he's sentenced to 5 years in jail. And once in jail, his first cellmate is a man called Richard Hickok, known as Dick. And obviously, as the two were in the same cell together, they spent a lot of time talking, eventually getting onto the subject of past jobs. Wells tells Hickok of his time with Mr. Clutter on this farm in western Kansas. Hickok asks if Mr. Clutter was a rich man. Yes, replies Wells. He explains how shortly before his time with the Clutters ended, Wells actually said that he witnessed her pay a large lumber bill. He thought he'd seen him pay it with cash that he'd taken from the safe inside his home. That week alone, he says, apparently Herb Clutter had spent $10,000 on bills. And apparently after that, Hickok never stops asking questions about the Clutters. How many were there? What ages would the kids be now? Exactly how did he get to the house? What was the layout of the house? Where did Mr. Clutter keep his safe? And Floyd Wells imparts all of his knowledge. And before he knows it, Hickok is talking about how he's planning on killing Mr. Clutter and he's describing in detail about how he's going to do it. Hickok spoke about a man called Perry Edward Smith. Smith and Hickok had met in prison in Lansing, and although Smith had been paroled, Hickok knew that he could always rely on Smith to partner with him. The two were pretty close. Some sources even suggest that the two had a gay relationship, but of course all these years later it can be nothing but speculation. But Hickok did seem to have a particular attachment to Perry Smith, and he spoke about how he was going to get Smith involved in this crime he was planning against the Clutters. Hickok would describe to Wells in detail about how he was going to commit this crime, how he was going to tie them up and shoot them down. But Wells never for 1 second actually believed he was going to do it. They were in prison, and a lot of that kind of talk happens in prison, trying to incite fear in the other inmates and try to just keep yourself safe. Or even just to show off or brag. Nobody actually takes that kind of talk seriously. And so neither did Wells, until he's lying in his cell one day listening to news broadcasts on the radio and hears about the tragic slaying of 4 members of the Clutter family in West Kansas. But he still doesn't say anything. He's in prison, and becoming known as a snitch would be worth more than his life, so he stays silent. He follows the news carefully for more information. When they announce the $1,000 reward, it's almost enough for him to speak, but he's still hesitant. I mean, as well as his fear of being known as a snitch in prison, he was also scared about the part that he'd had to play in this crime. Would the authorities see him as an accessory to murder in this case? I mean, he had practically led the murderers to the Clutter's door, although he'd done it unknowingly. Eventually, Wells just cannot take the burden anymore, and he confides in a fellow inmate, a religious man he could trust. The fellow inmate says that he'll sort it out for Wells to be called into the warden's office. That way it wouldn't look like Wells was snitching, it would look like he was in trouble for something himself. No one would suspect anything. So the next day, Wells gets called into the warden's office and he finally tells his story, 10 days later. So the police finally have their answer. They corroborate that Floyd Wells did indeed work for the Clutters 10 years earlier, and they managed to confirm his story. They get details of Perry Smith and Dick Hickok through, along with mugshots, and now they finally know who they're looking for. But of course, they don't know where they're supposed to actually be looking. The next step is finding them, and they focus on Hickok. Now, Richard Eugene Hickok was born in Kansas City, Kansas, to his farm worker parents. He was the firstborn son, a star athlete at school, baseball, basketball, football. He had a good childhood, he got good grades, he graduated high school, he planned to go to college, study engineering, but his family simply didn't have enough money to send him. So he gets a job with the Santa Fe Railway in Kansas City, and when he's 19, he marries a 16-year-old called Carol. Him and Carol rent a house, they buy a nice car, and Dick starts driving ambulances for the hospital. He then begins to work as a mechanic and a car painter. He seems to have a really good future ahead of him until one day he gets into a car accident. His car flips whilst he's driving and he lands in water on the side of the road, face down, and a passerby stops and pulls him out just before he drowns. He suffers a serious head injury that leaves him slightly disfigured for the rest of his life. His face is lopsided and his eyes are noticeably asymmetrical. His father said that Dick was just never the same after that. His personality changed. He started to commit petty crimes, he'd gamble, he'd write bad checks. He cheats on Carol with an older mistress and eventually leaves his wife for this mistress. In total, he has 3 children. Eventually his crimes catch up with him, he's stealing firearms and he's trying to sell them on, and he ends up in Lansing at the penitentiary, which is where he meets Floyd Wells. Perry Edward Smith was born in Huntington, Nevada, to rodeo performing parents, Tex and Flo. He was of mixed ancestry. His father was Irish, John Tex Smith, and his mother Native American, Cherokee Florence Flo Buckskin. Smith's childhood was not like Hickok's. It was volatile, to say the least. In 1929, the family moved to Alaska, where Tex would distill bootleg whiskey for a living. He was abusive to his wife and 4 children, and eventually she leaves, taking the children with her to live in San Francisco. Only she was an alcoholic, and life wasn't much better for them there. Perry clearly felt the full force of this unsettled childhood, and he's actually arrested in October 1937 on his 8th birthday. That was his first arrest, just 8 years old. Flo dies in an alcoholic coma, choking on her own vomit when Perry is just 13, and so him and his siblings are sort of flung around a number of orphanages and institutions where he's reportedly physically and emotionally abused. He eventually reunites with his father and the two live together, moving around much of the western US, but the two of them are just not a good pair. His father's not a good man, and turns out Perry wasn't either. He turns to petty crime to make a living, and he's got no education to his name. He eventually ends up in the army and serves in the Korean War. In 1952, he receives an honourable discharge from the army despite spending a lot of time in the stockade for fighting, and he's stationed at Fort Lewis in Washington. With his first check, he buys a motorcycle and ends up in a bad accident himself. He spends 6 months in hospital, and as a result of this accident, his legs are permanently disabled and he suffered with pain for the rest of his life, always on a cocktail of medication. Eventually, in 1956, he's convicted of grand larceny, jailbreak and car theft, and he ends up in Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, where him and Hickok strike up this close bond. Smith is released from jail early in 1959 and Hickok is released in early November of the same year. Immediately upon his release, Hickok writes to Smith asking him to violate his parole and return to Kansas to assist with a robbery that he'd been planning. Smith had told people in jail that he'd clubbed a black man to death, something that was actually highly unlikely, but people believed him and Hickok believed him wholeheartedly. And it's likely that Hickok relied on Smith to be the one to help him commit these crimes, this what he referred to as his big score, because he thought that Smith would kill if needed. Hickok was convinced that he was going to commit this crime, he was going to leave no witnesses behind. So like I said, Smith had been paroled earlier that year and he briefly lived with his father in Reno before the two fell out, and he ended up on the road, spending a month in Las Vegas before receiving this letter from Hickok. Smith agrees to come back to Kansas City, thinking that he'd also be able to reunite with another former inmate whilst he was there. And he actually ends up missing this former inmate by just a few hours. So he meets up with Hickok, who tells him of his full plan, and they immediately set to work. They drive to Holcomb, they enter the Clutter family home through an unlocked door in the late evening of November 14th. Their intention was to kill the family in order to steal cash from the safe. However, they soon discover that there was no such safe. No safe existed. They literally killed the Clutter family for no reason. After the murders, the pair headed to Kansas City, where Hickok briefly worked at a car paint shop for a few days, but he doesn't turn up at his job past the 20th, and on the 21st he passes a bad check for $192 at the Elko camera shop. The KBI, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, later questioned Hickok's parents, who say that Dick and Perry had made a trip to Fort Scott, Kansas on November 14th, allegedly to locate a sister of Perry's. According to the parents, they returned home shortly before lunch on November 15th, before then again departing, heading for Kansas City just after lunch. The KBI searched the premises, finding a bloody shirt in a drawer and a shotgun that Hickok had purchased. Now, of course, most people in Kansas owned a shotgun at this time, so this didn't really mean too much, but the KBI felt that at least it meant they were on the right track. After spending a short time in Kansas City and writing a number of bad checks, the pair decide to flee to Mexico, where they actually end up living for a short period of time. It's there that they pawn the radio and binoculars that they stole from the Clutters and sell the car they drove there to police officers. They actually eventually decide to return to the USA, intending to commit enough crimes and make enough money that they can then escape to Brazil, where they couldn't be extradited back to the USA if the crimes were eventually traced back to them. So they crossed back into the state 31 days after the murders. They mailed most of their belongings general delivery to Las Vegas, intending to pick them up later. They needed to lighten their load as much as possible to hitchhike across the USA. They hitchhike east, stealing a car in Iowa, and end up back in Kansas City. Hickok starts to pass a huge number of bad checks, over $500 in total. On December 16th, the authorities get a phone call from a furniture mart that a bad check's been used to purchase a TV set. The KBI heads straight there, and the employees positively identify a photo of Hickok. At the same time, a service station employee recognises Hickok as he tries to pass a bad check there. So the authorities are really hot on their tails at this point. From there, the pair drive on down to Miami, Florida, and they spend Christmas there. They sell on everything they bought with the bad checks in Miami, and then they carry on driving across the USA, zigzagging across the country, doing odd jobs here and there for money. Around New Year's, they decide to head back to Las Vegas, still driving the same car they'd stolen in Iowa, only the authorities had started to catch on to the number plate of this car. By the time they'd arrived back in Vegas and had picked up their belongings from the post office, the police stopped them. Finally, the killers had been apprehended. The police searched the trunk of the car and found 2 pairs of boots, one with a cat's paw sole design and the other with a diamond tread, the same 2 boot prints found at the Clutter murder scene. This was the critical piece of evidence that linked them to the murders. Without this, everything else would have been purely circumstantial. They had only just picked up these deliveries of these boots from the post office. If the police had apprehended them even an hour earlier, they wouldn't have had these boots on them, and this vital piece of evidence would have been missed. This was just pure good luck on the police's behalf. The Kansas police head right out to Las Vegas to interview Hickok and Smith, and they actually decide to focus on Hickok, who was someone they knew would be more likely to talk. Smith was colder, he was more cut off from the world. Hickok was chatty and charming. And so the police start off by going over the bad checks that we found in the Kansas City area before asking outright about the murder of the Clutter family. They let Hickok know that they had an absolute piece of evidence that placed both of them at the scene of the murders. There was no way they could back out from this. And Hickok does indeed start to talk. He says outright, "Now here's the thing on something like this. Is there any way I can get out on a manslaughter charge? Because I never pulled a trigger. In fact, I didn't know what the goddamn hell was going on. I was in the other room when it first happened." He blamed every death on Perry Smith. Whilst Perry Smith remained very quiet, he was much better at avoiding the questions. He denied any knowledge of the Clutter murders at first. Hickok was in the other room basically giving a full confession. The two are eventually driven back to Kansas in separate cars, Hickok in the car in front and Smith in the car behind. This was intentional, as investigators knew that Hickok just couldn't seem to shut up, he couldn't stop talking. And they knew that if Smith was able to see Hickok just chatting away to investigators in the car in front, Smith would probably get a little bit angry, and that's exactly what does happen. Smith gets mad and he starts talking to the investigator in his car. He says to the investigator that the two had agreed to stay silent if they were ever caught, but there's Hickok talking away. Well, now he's going to tell his version of the story. And so he starts talking. He talks to this investigator about receiving this letter from Dick, about how he stayed at Dick's parents' house for putting new tyres on the car and heading to Holcomb the next morning. They had Dick's shotgun and a whole hunting jacket full of shells and more shells in the boot of the car. They stop on the journey to buy some cord because they knew they'd have to be tying up people, and they bought all the cord the store had, which would have been enough to tie up about 12 to 14 people. They arrive at the Clutter house between 12 and 1 AM, searching around for the safe. Whilst they're searching around, they run into Mr. Clutter and they ask him where the safe is. He replies that there's no safe, he kept no money in the house. But Dick was insistent that he was lying, although Smith believed that he was telling the truth. Hickok orders Smith to cut the phone lines, and then they go upstairs and wake up Bonnie, who reiterates what Herb had already said. There was no safe in the house. Then they wake up Kenyon before lastly getting Nancy, who was already awake by this point. Now, in his version of events, Smith insists that he was disgusted with Hickok's attitude. He was shocked at how Hickok was acting. He'd never seen him this way before, and he said that he believed the family when they said there was no safe in the house, but Hickok refused to believe them. So they decide to separate the family. They tie them up one by one in different rooms around the house. They continue to ask Mr. Clutter about the money, although they've already found about $50 in change around the house by this point. Herbert said that if he had money in the house, he would have given it to them by now. And Smith looks over at Hickok and says, "What now?" Hickok says that they're to leave no witnesses. Now, bear in mind that Hickok had chosen Smith for this crime particularly because he thought Smith had it in him to be a murderer if needed. So the two debate about who's going to go first, and eventually Smith, angry and frustrated at this situation and at Dick, stabs Mr. Clutter in the throat with his hunting knife. He then tells Hickok to do his part, who stabs Mr. Clutter again in the same hole. Smith then shoots Mr. Clutter in the head, and then he shoots Kenyon, then Nancy, then Bonnie. So Hickok was right. When push came to shove, Smith would be the person to murder. Although there is debate as to whether this is the true version of events or not, there's a lot of dispute as to who killed the two women. Hickok testified that Smith killed all 4 family members, but Smith actually first confessed that Hickok killed the women, but then refused to sign his own confession, saying that he'd shot them himself instead. But they both refused to later testify in court, leading to a lack of an official record detailing who actually killed them. So the defence's only defense when it came to the trial was insanity. They had to use insanity to try and keep these men from the death sentence. A psychiatrist was called in to assess both of them. Hickok was assessed to be impulsive, possibly caused by this previous head injury he had, and he had a complete lack of feeling. But he actually did feel remorse about the murders, or at least remorse about getting caught, saying that he would be mad if somebody did the same thing to his family. Did his brain injury really cause him to go on to commit these murders? Would he have done this pre-brain injury? But there was something else as well. Hickok was known for having an attraction to teenage girls. I mean, his first wife was just a 16-year-old girl, which was young but not so creepy when he was only 19 himself. But this attraction to teenagers remained as he got older. He later wrote that one of the main reasons he actually wanted to go to the Clutter house was not to rob them, but to rape 16-year-old Nancy. And it's one of the reasons that he refused to stop, even when he realised there was no safe in the house. And he would have raped Nancy, he said, had Smith not stopped him. and Smith was ready to like full on fight him. Apparently for Smith, rape was way too far. Murder wasn't, but rape was too far. Perry Smith was very interested in talking to the psychiatrist himself. He wanted to know what made himself tick. He said that there was obviously something wrong with him or he would never have killed those people. The psychiatrist said that he was paranoid and borderline delusional, indicative of a psychotic mind state. He'd had a very, very difficult childhood that had seriously messed him up in later years. He had serious anger problems and a temper unlike anything people had ever seen. He didn't want to be in the Clutter house. He wanted to turn back when he realised there was no safe. He didn't want to kill. He stopped Hickok from raping Nancy, but he went on to kill at least 2, if not all 4 members of the household. He just completely lost his temper and he wanted to get out of there knowing that Dick wouldn't leave if he didn't. Which isn't an excuse for murder by any means, but it is an interesting motive. Smith didn't want to be there, he didn't want to murder, but he did it anyway. But does this count as enough for an insanity plea? Well, it wasn't. But you've got to question Hickok's head injury and Smith's potential psychotic mind state at the time. But the judge basically brought it all down to the question of, does this person know right from wrong? For Hickok, the psychiatrist's answer was yes, he does know right from wrong. For Smith, the doctor said that he actually wasn't able to form an opinion. Both had been charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, and there was no doubt of guilt. Like I said, it was really about whether they were going to get the death sentence or not. On March 29th, 1960, a verdict of guilty was returned and death penalty was recommended. For the next 5 years, both men lived on death row at the federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. They were executed by hanging in the gallows on April 14th, 1965, Hickok at 12:41 a.m. and Smith at 1:19 a.m. The last words of Smith were, "I think it's a hell of a thing that life has to be taken in this manner. I say this especially because there's a great deal I could have offered society. I certainly think capital punishment is legally and morally wrong. Any apology for what I have done would be meaningless at this time. I don't have any animosities towards anyone involved in this matter. I think that is all." When Hickok was about to face his death, he motioned for an agent who basically played a major role in his arrest to come forward to where he was standing and said to him, "You're sending me to a better place." And he added that he did not bear any grudge against him for his role in the case, and then he shook hands with this agent and said goodbye. They brutally slayed 4 members of a nice, enemy-less family, this wonderful, upstanding family, for $50, a pair of binoculars and a portable radio. Interestingly, it came out years later that the Clutter family murders may not have been the only murders that Hickok and Smith were involved in. In December 2012, both their bodies were exhumed from the cemetery as the authorities had hoped to solve a 53-year-old cold case with their DNA, the case of the Walker family, Cliff and Christine Walker, and their 2 young children, 3-year-old Jimmy and 1-year-old Debbie. The whole family had been murdered by gunshot in their home in Osprey, Florida on December 19th, 1959. At the time, Hickok and Smith were known to be in Florida spending Christmas there, and they weren't far from where this crime took place. They were suspected at the time, but a polygraph cleared them of the murders, but by modern polygraph standards, the results would no longer be considered valid. So by exhuming the bodies, the authorities hoped to match DNA to semen found on Christine Walker. She'd been raped by her murderer. But by August 2014, it was announced they'd been unable to find a match between the DNA. Only partial DNA could be retrieved from the bones, and the samples found on Christine were too old, degraded and contaminated. So Hickok and Smith still can't exactly be ruled in or out. They're still considered to be the #1 suspects in the Walker family case. Let me know if you'd like a full case on the Walker family, and I would highly recommend picking up Truman Capote's In Cold Blood if you want an even more in-depth sort of view of this case. It's not regarded by today's standards as being entirely accurate, and definitely takes a sympathetic view of Perry Smith. Truman and Smith actually became really good friends while Smith was in prison on death row, and it's widely thought that there was more than just a friendship between the two. Capote was an openly gay man. But even forgetting to look at it from an accuracy standpoint, it is just a really good book. I would recommend you read it. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure you leave any case recommendations in the comments down below, and tune in again at 4:30 p.m. tomorrow for another video, or check out my mystery playlist, which I'll link down below. Thank you so much for watching. Bye guys.